Beginning in the late 1950s, Larry Snyder started a home-based fiberglass business, which grew during the next 30-plus years into a builder of a multitude of industry-leading plastic products. Over the course of 9 days of interviews in 2012, the story was told to producer Bill Gansel. The interviews were held in various locations, including Larry's office, where he keeps his extensive collection of oil cans. It all began with a summer job building boats out of fiberglass in a small town in Nebraska.
I needed a summer job for 1957, and so I went down there and applied at the fiberglass boat company down there in Waverly, not knowing anything about the plastics business and not knowing. I knew the fellow that owned it. Harry Schmidt hired me.
Larry designed a boat for Schmidt's business, which was built and sold as the Guardian 500.
It wasn't shortly after that then that he wanted me to repair the boats. So I took over the boat repair out in my garage and alleyway of the corn crib and the hog shed and the hay mow in the barn.
This boat repairing business was the beginning of Snyder Fiberglass. The income helped fund his college education. For Larry, a college education at Nebraska Wesleyan University was his grounding for business.
Probably the most influence anybody had on me was Dr. Metcalf at Nebraska Wesleyan University. He was absolutely a great guy, understood business, understood the real business of business. If you understand accounting, you understand what you have to do in business, controlling everything, inventories, cost, labor, marketing and advertising and those sort of things. Accounting was cut and dried. There wasn't much ambiguity between one and one being two, and so I kind of liked that sort of thing.
During college, Larry was dating Cheryl, a University of Nebraska Lincoln student.
I say I have a vicarious degree in business administration from Wesleyan, simply because he was so enthused about what he was studying that was largely our dates. He was telling me about what he had been learning.
Throughout college, Larry kept doing fiberglass jobs, including one that turned out to be a lot of fun for a legendary racing enthusiast and businessman.
Bill Smith, of course, which is the leader in the industry for hot rod parts and hot rods and things like that. I'm walking down the street one day, going down to Gail Condon's, Condon Auto Electric, because I built him some go-kart parts out of fiberglass. And I hear this voice saying, "Hey, you the guy, the fiberglass guy that's got the shop out on the farm?" And of course it was Bill Smith, and everybody likes to imitate Bill. That's my imitation. But anyway, your name Leroy? He said, I got an old body. So anyway, I took that old body and put a lot of body putty in, a lot of fiberglass, a lot of masonite, and got it put together. Took a mold off of it, and we built, hundreds of parts out of that old 32 Austin Roadster. He sold a lot of them.
Larry continued to build these parts on the farm while a student at Nebraska Wesleyan.
When I was in college, they told me how to finance General Motors, but they never told me how to go to the local bank and borrow $500.
The part-time business during college required some innovative financing.
But when I went to laying up these roadster bodies and things like this, well, I needed a full roll of mat and cloth. So I hawked my saxophone and bought a roll of mat and cloth with that. I don't know, did I borrow some money from you too?
I think so.
I think I borrowed money from Cheryl too.
In 1961, Larry graduated from Wesleyan, married his sweetheart and business partner, Cheryl, and enrolled in graduate school at Arizona State. Larry took graduate-level finance and marketing classes at Arizona State in anticipation of a future career with a Fortune 500 company. He had an opportunity to interview with a major corporation, Borg Warner, in Chicago, and thought he could see a path to Easy Street.
I'm scared to death to go to Chicago, All I knew about was the mafia and all the things to look out for. I meet a fellow by the name of Bill Whitaker, the personnel manager at Borg Warner, and then he tells me about what the job would be like, that I'd be in a training program, and They would take me all around to the different plants and so forth like that. So then we got to talking some more. And, well, probably after an hour, you know, he said, Larry, he said, you wouldn't last in this job. He said, this isn't the job for you. He said, you need to go back home. You need to get in business for yourself. Well, you know, thinking about it, that's the best thing that ever happened.
After deciding that the corporate world wasn't a good option, Larry and Cheryl returned to Nebraska. Cheryl had taught math in Arizona and would teach math in Lincoln Public Schools for 7 more years. Snyder Fiberglass Company would become a full-time business.
Then we decided, I guess someplace along the line, that if we were going to be a real company, that we really ought to move into Lincoln. So we moved out of the chicken house down there and moved into half of a Venetian blind building up here on 48th Street.
Like many small companies that become successful, those first years were lean.
I think the first wage that I ever drew was probably 1965 or 66 when we moved down to the building that burned, and then it was like $90 a month. I mean, that was a lot of money back then. And when you're starting out like that, you hate to add more payroll.
Are you a workaholic?
Well, I pretty much was. And I didn't have anything else to do.
This would have been when you were still teaching. What did you do during the evenings?
I was right there working. I would typically leave school, go over to the plant, do whatever needed done. If there was paperwork to be done, I'd do that. If they needed help in the shop, I'd do some of that.
Cheryl was the best help I ever had. She didn't mess up. You know, she knew what needed to be done and how it needed to be done.
My role was numbers, and although I had not had any bookkeeping, no accounting, no background in that, it was easy for me.
From early on, Larry was always looking for opportunities. As a true entrepreneur, he didn't have a long-range strategic plan. Product development was an ongoing process.
I didn't have any great ideas about what direction we were going, and it's always been my philosophy to take advantage of opportunities, regardless of what they are. And I've taken advantage and lost of a lot of opportunities, but the ones that have succeeded have served us very well. You know, how do you develop new products? And I said, we used to drive down the road and say, well, let's build this. You got to try to determine, is there a market for this product? Can we improve that product? And maybe, how do we improve it? To make it more aesthetic, or we improve it to take cost out of it? You know, in other words, how can we redesign the product to fit our style of manufacturing too? So, you know, we just didn't pick one out and manufactured it. But we always went through a process to see who we were going to compete with.
Throughout the 1960s and 70s, there was a dizzying array of products for many different markets.
I started out with the boat business. We still had the car body business, getting into the go-kart business, Corvette repair. We built a lot of parts for high gain, antenna mass.
A couple of the products from vacuum form, one of them was a splash block.
Then, of course, the ag tank business came along. A lot of the liquid fertilizers and different farm chemicals were just coming into being. We trucked tanks all over the United States. Yeah, we built burial vaults, built a lot of tub showers. Tub showers were one of our major product lines along with the tanks. Fiberglass window well covers. We built some portable toilets. We built hose mandrels for Goodyear. We did a lot of products for Lincoln Industries. We built them a lot of plating tanks. National Crane, yes, we did a lot of work for Marlowe. Berg Manufacturing at Waverly, building man baskets for him. Cushman, we did a lot of work for Cushman. We built their Mailster box cover.
You built a super slide for a local department store.
50 feet tall and 150 feet long. It was a promotional gimmick. I think it was the state health department. They wanted to show the veins in a body. This statue was probably, 20 feet tall. A couple of years later, they brought it back out and they wanted to make a Buffalo Bill out of it. They made a hat out of chicken wire. We just put new clothes on the naked guy.
The most successful products for Snyder fiberglass were tanks for agricultural use. The farm background of Larry and Cheryl, as well as many employees, was helpful in addressing the ag market.
This fella come to my office one day, Bob Caldwell. He owned Caldwell Manufacturing out at Kearney, and he wanted to know if I could build him a tank, a fiberglass tank. So I said, well, yes, I can. So I built the tooling, of which we patented. We patented the design criteria on the tank itself, different than any other tank that had been built because it had a plastic liner on the inside of it that no other tanks had, where our competition had the glass fiber exposed to the surface in a lot of instances, and the chemicals that they put in would travel the path of the glass fiber, and therefore the tank would imbibe the chemicals in the tank. I don't know how many tanks that we hauled to Colorado, but there were 500-gallon tanks that sat on skids out of fiberglass that sat beside the center pivot. And then they injected fertilizer into the irrigation water.
The fiberglass ag tank product was selling well when disaster struck in 1966.
We got a call one morning at 3 o'clock in the morning, and this fella called and he said, Larry, the plant's on fire. The firemen are here, but they don't think they're going to be able to save it. So we drove over there, of course, and there was nothing left.
Snyder Fiberglass temporarily used a night shift at another fiberglass shop and then moved into a building adjacent to the one that burned. There was very little interruption in production. Tractor Supply Company was a major customer in the 1960s and 70s, and TSC had stores all over the nation. Snyder Fiberglass had to develop an efficient means of transporting light but bulky tanks.
We decided that we would take a couple trailer house trailers, make tank hauling rigs out of those. We finally set up our own transportation company so we could get backhauls then.
Larry's college courses had included advertising and marketing, and these classes provided an understanding of the importance of getting the word out. During the late 1960s, Snyder Fiberglass produced its own advertising materials. Later, Bozell and Jacobs and Swanson Russell agencies were utilized.
Always believed that if you had a good product, you ought to tell people about it. So I've been a promoter of advertising forever, since I was out of college. And so we started doing some of our own advertising. We had Swanson Russell do a survey one time. What percentage of the farmers had a Snyder tank on their farm? Well, the survey come out over 80%. Now, we don't think that's true, but Snyder had such a reputation that if they had a tank on their farm, why, they'd tell them it was a Snyder tank, you know.
Often, entrepreneurs need a little help. Larry and Cheryl were fortunate to have made connections with an attorney, an insurance agent, along with an accountant and landlord, all of whom were very willing to spend the time necessary to help these young business people understand these areas of expertise.
Bill Grossman was our attorney, and Bill was a fellow that, I mean, was just genuine individual. Very intelligent guy, but very down-to-earth individual. And he and Larry Coy are the two people that I think Cheryl and I relied upon an awful lot about business, because we didn't know anything about business. We'd never been in business. And they kind of became our mentors then. For Larry Coy, you know, I got to understand the insurance industry then. You need business interruption. We said, well, we can't really afford business interruption. He said, yes, you can. And a lot of time just talk about business as such, you know, just general conversation as friends. And both Larry Coy and Bill Grossman understood what I was and where I was going and what I was going to do maybe before I did.
In the early 1970s, developments in the plastic industry were superseding fiberglass for some applications. Fiberglass ag tanks were not selling well, and the business was suffering.
The fiberglass tanks were more expensive, and we were losing market share. We got into financial difficulty, and we were looking for a buyout or a merger or anything, you know, to get out of the situation. because we owed it close to $1 million.
At roughly this same time, Snyder tub showers enjoyed a stellar reputation.
I'm sitting in the office one day, and my secretary calls and says, "There's a guy in here that wants to see you. He says he's got money." This guy comes back. He's a slight-built guy and got a little funny cap on and moccasins. He sits down in a chair like I'm sitting here. My desk is right here. He puts his feet up on on my desk. "I understand you need money." "Yeah," I said, "I need a lot of it." He says, "Well, I got it." Well, the guy happened to be George Martin, who was the owner of Skagway Department Stores.
George Martin had been playing bridge at a friend's house when he saw a Snyder tub and shower combination. He liked it. The friend mentioned that Snyder's needed a cash infusion.
He says, "I'm going to give you the money to do what you need to get done." Now, he says, "I'll own all the company." But he says, "When you buy it back, you only buy half of it back and we'll give you the other half. What do you need?" And I said, "Well, here's what we need. We need to get into rotational molding polyethylene business."
Larry and George went to a builder of rotational molding machines in Akron, and George convinced Larry to buy a bigger machine than he ever thought he would need.
We set that machine up and we run that thing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We use the best quality material available, and our major competitor, their machinery was completely different than what we had bought, and they couldn't mold cross-link material. So we basically had a superior product. We understood the market and we understood distribution, and so we were easy to convert from a fiberglass tank to a rotationally molded tank.
The process involves loading plastic powder into a mold, then cycling the mold into an oven. The mold is rotated in the oven while the plastic melts onto the interior surface. At the completion of the heating cycle, the mold is moved to a cooling chamber and then to an unloading station. The best quality material was cross-linked polyethylene.
Cross-linked polyethylene is what it says. It cross-links itself. The regular polyethylene just melts itself together. The cross-linked polyethylene has a chemical bond between molecules. Other polyethylene just has a mechanical bond. In other words, it can just break apart. But it's tougher to break a chemical bond than it is to break a mechanical bond.
The Akron McNeil allowed for larger tanks, larger than Larry thought there was a market for, specifically for the application of fertilizer and chemicals through center pivot irrigation.
We didn't even think about big tanks. Nothing above 500-gallon horizontals at that time. One of our fiberglass tank distributors come up with an idea that he wanted to make an 1,100-gallon flat-bottom tank. And I said, "No, there's no market for 1,100-gallon flat-bottom tanks." Well, of course, how wrong I was. Anyway, we built the guy then 1,100-gallon tanks. Well, gee, many Christmas, then they started selling. There was a lot of theory back then, and still is, that you can spoon feed the corn plant as it grows, and that's the best way to do it.
The rotational molding technology allowed for the development of more ag tank designs as well as for other industrial products. The name Snyder Fiberglass was changed to Snyder Industries in 1974 to reflect the change in technology.
AM General, I think, was building this vehicle, the Humvee. So they said, "We want you to design and engineer a fuel tank that will set at an angle of just say 20 degrees and still be able to run the vehicle." General Dynamics, we built the fuel tanks for the M1 tank. A company out of Crawfordsville, Indiana came to us and they made pickles, and they wanted pickle brine tanks. Well, these are gigantic tanks. Open top mold 2 at a time. I think you gotta have a good idea, and then you have to have the initiative to make it happen.
Larry had heard of one big machine, but decided to build one that was, well, bigger, perhaps the biggest in the industry. They called it the Big Machine.
We had a salesman that could fur out anything. And he said, Larry, he says, I just saw the biggest rotational molding machine I've ever seen. And I just saw the biggest tank I've ever seen. I said, where are you at? He says, I'm in Monroe, Louisiana. He says, Larry, there's a tank down there that has to be 5,000 gallon. So anyway, I called him up and I went down there, and they had built their own machine, and it was quite a machine, but it worked.
Larry had heard that even in the 70s and 80s, the oil and gas industry was using a technique called fracking. They used large amounts of water and chemicals to dislodge oil and gas from horizontal seams.
Huge tank, and the reason for the 22,000 gallon tank was because I was told in the oil fields down in Oklahoma that that'd be a good size for a frac tank.
Larry remembered seeing alfalfa dehydrating mills that had a rotating method of operation.
It was a big cylinder like a cement mixer, and they rotated it, and the alfalfa went in there and came out dried. They were just a big cylinder on, I don't know, I call them trunnions on rollers. I thought, well, if I put rollers here, rollers here, rollers here, rollers here, then just turn it, put rollers on then the sides too, so when it turned, this big ring, drive the big ring with a chain that you could probably mount a mold in. So I went to Akron, McNeil, and asked them about it, and they thought, oh, it's a pretty good idea. So anyway, that's the way they built the machine then.
Bonds were issued in 1979 to finance the Big Machine and a new building on the site of the old Union Airport north of Lincoln. A groundbreaking was attended by Lincoln's mayor, Helen Busalis, and many dignitaries. The facility was completed in about a year, and limited production had started when the mold mounting ring and frame of the Big Machine broke in the oven.
It was relatively early in the life of that machine when it crashed.
It was less than a year because, remember, we didn't have any orders yet. It's a very sick feeling, and knowing that you're probably lost one season now, and you're going to have to go another year before you ever get another product built. The thing went down. It dropped the corner of the picture frame, which housed it, put a gouge in the oven in there 6 feet deep. Just the ring itself that went in there weighed 18,000 pounds, and everything come out okay because we put it back together, reinforced it better, and did some other things too. I imagine it was 6 months though before we had it back up and running. We sold a lot of 5,000, 10,000, 12,000, and 15,000 gallon tanks then.
The success of rotational molding and the Big Machine provided the opportunity for Snyder Industries to issue additional bonds to buy out the ownership position of George Martin and Skagway in 1983. In the late 70s and early 80s, concentrated liquid ag chemicals were being developed. These were distributed in small plastic jugs.
If the fellow had 160 acres, he might have 10 jugs of chemical. The EPA was really concerned about these chemicals that might be left in a jug. You see these jugs all over the farm country out there. We thought, you know, that the best thing to do was to build like a 60-gallon bulk tank or a 110-gallon or 200-gallon bulk tank that would hold bulk chemical. A lot of the locals bought that idea. None of the majors did right off the bat. Until you got the major chemical companies to buy into it, where there wasn't going to be a very big market.
Ciba-Geigy was one of the first major chemical companies that expressed interest.
They said, well, if you can come up with something, sure, you know, I will take a look at it. We got it engineered so it would be stackable. It had to be stackable and forkliftable from all four directions, the vertical ones. We decided to make a mock-up. So then we show up at Ciba-Geigy. So the packaging guys bring in the marketing guys, and when he looks at it, he says, I like this. I really like this, and walks around it, and he says, He don't even ask the cost. He don't even ask the cost. He just says to the purchasing manager, he says, give these guys a purchase order for the tooling for prototypes on this, okay? So we got the purchase order for the tooling, and so a year later, well, we got the contract in, and I don't remember how many we built that year, maybe 3,000 or something like that. And so I said to him, I said, you mean design sells chemical? He says, unfortunately, but fortunately for us, it does.
Snyder Industries built many bulks of other designs for most of the major agricultural chemical companies, and they provided similar products to other industrial customers throughout the late 1980s. Snyder Industries was back on an up cycle in the late 1980s, and Larry and Cheryl started thinking about selling the company.
We had no children. We had no particular situation where we had a succession plan. Mm-hmm. We'd tried a couple of, quote, professional managers, unquote, that we didn't have much success with. We didn't really know that we wanted to get much bigger. There were just a lot of things that contributed to thinking the succession plan is sell the business.
If we had to do it over, I don't think we would have changed anything. I think we kind of had a sense that the commercial chemical business, the transportation of the containers that hold it, was a potentially bigger market than ever the ag market was.
As I look back on the almost 30 years of Snyder Industries, there was something new and different going on almost all the time. Some projects weren't as big as others, but there wasn't really an opportunity to get bored with the business. It was just a matter of, do we want to watch this thing go through another down cycle, which everybody knows that that's going to happen.
We both figured out that we probably had enough money we could live the style and we were accustomed to, and we probably weren't going to change.
A business broker, Goldsmith Agio, was hired, and after a few false starts, a potential buyer was found with a venture capital firm from Canada. This firm would provide the financial backing for the purchasers. Today, the company is still an industry leader, capitalizing on the foundation that Larry and Cheryl Snyder built. It has been expanded by acquisitions and sold several more times since 1991, but the headquarters has remained in Lincoln.
That group just sold for $830 million. That's darn near $1 billion. That's unbelievable. A lot of our old employees are still there, and I'm sure that they're the ones that are making it go.
Larry and Cheryl left Snyder Industries in 1991. They're retired, but they still go to the office almost every day.
People say, well, you still have an office? I thought you were out of business. Well, we are, but we've hung out in an office since we were 22 years old, so, you just don't change right away.
They have been involved in a variety of businesses since 1991, including restaurants, farming, and other ag and tech-related businesses. With all operating entities concluded as of 2007, Larry has more time to spend fishing.
There's a bass, guys. Cool. Not a big one, but...
It'll look bigger than that way.
That got big.
Shoot a still for me, would you? Thank you.